And then the next thing is like, people understand, okay, steel frames, I have to put a thermal break in. But they they don't put the thermal break in, they put a thermal break on. So you see things then where they have this thermal kind of break strip that gets attached to the outside of the steel frame or to the very inside of the steel frame, and they're totally useless. The outside of your structure is at outside temperature. Imagine 0 degrees outside means the outside of the structure is at 0 degrees, which means the inside and the outside of your thermal break are both at 0 degrees. It's totally useless. It's not thermally disconnecting anything.
Hello and welcome to the Building Biology Potty, where we talk about better buildings to live and breathe in. My name is Jess Kismet, and today I am joined by Michael Kingsland from Laros Technologies in Canberra. Laros are a retailer and they are also a consultancy, sort of similar to Climasure, but bigger. They sell windows, mechanical ventilation systems, they consult on passive house, air tightness, thermal bridging, and all that good stuff. Michael works with builders, designers, and other consultants to push the envelope and ensure best practice outcomes. We spent a couple of days together in Auckland in the beginning of the year at the ProClimate install training with some other ProClimate partners in Australia. And hearing him in the classroom explaining a few things to the room, I decided I definitely wanted to have him on the show. You're a super smart guy, Michael, and I'm pleased to have you. So Thank you for joining me.
Yeah, thanks a lot also for the intro. Excited to be here. Thanks.
Awesome. So could you please start off with a background on who you are and why you started Laros or how Laros came to be for you?
Yeah, so I didn't actually start Laros. It's been around for a while, since 2009. The name kind of has it in it to some degree. So originally Laros started out as a solar business. So if you letters is an anagram for solar, Laros, solar.
That's a little fun fact, Laros.
Scramble the letters around, yeah. Now, we didn't do any building-related stuff at all to start with, so just solar. So the guys who actually started it were kind of solar researchers from the Australian National University here in Canberra at the Solar Thermal Group. And that's kind of how I kind of came into that as well. So I was working my PhD about 15, 16 years later after the guys that started Laros, and met Andreas, who was one of the founders there.
Is Andreas now Rayco Skylights?
Yeah, Rayco Pacific and KLH.
Rayco Pacific, yeah. We've been dealing with him on a couple of our passive house projects. I saw his name and I was like, I know that name.
Skylights.
Yeah.
Exactly. So also CLT, he imports CLT still. People are familiar with that. So yeah, kind of the start of it was originally solar. And people were passionate about, renewable energy, that kind of things. And I joined in 2012. And we kind of were supplying the first large-scale solar systems in Canberra, so 100, 200 kilowatt kind of size. There were lots of support kind of programs coming in around the time as well. The government supported solar, of course. And we, kind of what we did, we designed the systems and we supplied the products, and we didn't install ourselves. So we had kind of subcontracted installers, and with more support from the government, we found more and more we actually started competing with our own installers. So they kind of learned from us how to design systems and where the products came from and things like that. And just kind of, counter offers. And because the install kind of part of the whole project was so large that, we found it harder and harder to compete with that. And incidentally, at the same time, so that Andreas, his background from Switzerland originally, actually used to be the director of the Swiss Institute of certifying and testing high performance building products. So that the Swiss have a similar kind of scheme compared to passive house. It's called Minergie in Switzerland, and it's very, very similar. So part of his passion was already always from that high performance building side. He knew the bleeding edge of products and what's kind of really required to make buildings work. So it was kind of one of our advantages and made it easy then to shift into the high performance building space. Myself, I started at Laros. We did solar. We started importing products from Europe, or we're already importing products, and I wanted to improve my own building. And I thought, let's look for windows first.
Your own house?
We started talking about importing windows, and then straight away we had 3-4 other people. What, you bringing windows in from Germany? I want them as well, and me as well. And then things rolled off that way. And we're importing business, so we knew how that works. It was easy to bring in container loads of stuff, and it kind of kickstarted that whole side of the business.
Awesome. So that was your own house you wanted those windows for?
Yeah. So my dream was originally to make my own windows. I kind of like doing hands-on stuff as well. So I like working with timber. So I thought I'll make my own timber windows and get some glass in from Germany and make them. But then, of course, you start working in a job and you're busy, and you suddenly find that, and it's a small business. It's not a 9-to-5 job. So there's kind of more work there than days, really. And that's how the whole kind of, let's just buy them from Germany. Yeah, that's what kind of kicked that off. Yeah. So yeah, and the windows that we were looking at, one of the important things for us was right away, not just to get any kind of plastic window or really good high performance window, but also kind of from a sustainability aspect. I really like timber windows. There's all sorts of timber around in the world, of course. And there's tropical harvesting of timbers. There's timber that come from Siberia that kind of are very kind of common on the German market as well. And for me, it was important to not just have that kind of performance aspect, but also the sustainability aspect. And one of the things that kind of really brought us toward our current supplier is their kind of ethical and sustainable kind of background. They committed to a German scheme that says all the timber that they use for their own manufacturing has to come from within 300 kilometers of the factory. So it's sustainable German forestry versus questionable kind of, we all know about the stories about, tropical rainforests being cut down for all sorts of things. And yep, there's certificates, but there's been also issues with all the certification schemes. And I know from having grown up in Germany, obviously, that the way that Germans do forestry, rather than those big plantations that Australians might be used to, they actually harvest from actively used forests, so recreational forests. They pick out individual trees, and it's still a recreational forest. And it's actually beautiful for us to go
so they
into.
kind of take a little bit from here and a little bit from there.
Yeah, exactly. They get the really high quality trees from certain areas rather than kind of clear felling a whole area and getting all sorts of stuff that they completely
and destroying the soil in the process when you constantly turn it over. Yeah, wow.
The forest lives while it's being used for commercial purposes, and it's pretty cool. Yeah, I really like that about it.
That is really cool. I think timber and forestry, it's definitely an area that I have not learnt much about in my travels. And it's something that when I was learning about the leaky building crisis in New Zealand, and they were talking about how they didn't treat they stopped treating their timber frame, like their timbers, and then the quality of the timber and all this blah, 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 blah. I was like, oh my goodness, timber and where it comes from and how it's treated and the quality of it is absolutely crucial.
There's so many follow-on effects. I mean, people always think about carbon miles and imported carbon and things like that. And then again, plastic to timber is kind of an easy kind of step. And you think, oh, timber is more sustainable because you have this embodied carbon. Plastic windows are made from, non-renewable resources. There's raw oil that needs to be extracted out of the ground and processed to make it plastic in the first place, things like that. But then timber is like, where does it come from? How far has the timber actually traveled before it even is being made into a window? And that kind of chain that even comes before the windows are made in the first place. And has that been done sustainably or not? And it's really important as well. So
absolutely. But we don't think about
long, complicated kind of journey.
It's convoluted.
Until we get to our products. That's right.
Yeah. Very cool. Very cool. So when you talk to builders who are new to passive house, I mean, I've written in the question passive house principles, but I know we're not allowed to say that anymore.
Look, that's great. I think that's really, I think that's quite, that's a great
Let's talk about
passive house principles. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's one of my kind of big things. I find the passive house principle term a bit of a misconception and a problem because it kind of, to some degree, pushes people away from certain principles if they don't actually aim for passive house. And I think there's no such thing as passive house principles. They're general, common, good building practice principles, essentially. And all those things are as important in any building. Is it a passive house or not a passive house? So passive house, you can think of like a Ferrari in terms of a car, super high performance. But how many people do you see on the street that actually drive a Ferrari? So they're great. But all those principles also apply to buildings that don't go quite to the same performance level. And the balance is a really important issue there. So maybe if we just go through the principles again, so passive house principles are generally understood as air tightness. Then they've got super insulation, so very, very kind of thick insulation in your walls, seamless insulation or thermal bridge reduction, high performance windows, and then the ventilation system with heat recovery. And I think one important thing that's actually missing there, and there's kind of a bit of a double up with the insulation. I think the insulation should be kind of one point. It should always be as seamless as possible. And the level, again, that I talked about then is more how close you get to passive house performance or how much insulation is in there. And the thing that's missing in the whole thing is actually the solar heat gain control in terms of how much energy comes in through your windows. So high performance windows make sense, but especially Australians are often used to, from traditional construction, to have part of your solar heat gain control is having internal blinds and fittings and curtains and things like that, and fixed external kind of passive shading elements. But if you start looking at higher performance, double or triple glazing, those internal things don't do anything for you anymore from a thermal point of view because your glass is such a better insulator compared to what you put on the inside. Anything that comes through your glass, you have to deal with inside the building. Passive shading elements are okay in some circumstances, but they're usually designed for the 21st of December. solstice, highest kind of sun angle, and for the 21st of June, when the sun's at the lowest, but then we have shoulder seasons. And shoulder seasons means now we're looking at, March, April, where those passive shading elements don't work for you anymore, and the sun comes right in because of
And
a
it's
much
still
lower sun
hot
angle.
as
But
in
we have
Adelaide
30-degree
in
days now
March.
in April still. So literally our seasons kind of change. We have longer summers, hotter summers, and the sun comes in. And in my mind, the thing that works best is external active shading. So you have blinds, you can press a button when you want them, and you can put them away, especially if it's a gray day, if it's cold outside or something, you want to get as much light in as possible, where passive shading elements might actually obstruct your views. They might shade you when you don't need to shade. So it's kind of a lower kind of light quality inside your building. Use blinds that you can control, ideally. That's and what was the other thing? So the second part is the not taking into account some of those principles if you're not aiming for passive house. And we get that argument a lot. He'll say, well, air tightness is really important from an energy efficiency point of view, but we really don't kind of want to get the passive house performance because it's so expensive or whatever. So we don't need to be quite as airtight, and we can then ignore, for example, internal wraps. And then I kind of said, well, actually, internal wraps are not for airtightness. That's kind of one misconception.
We did talk about this in New Zealand. We talked about this in Auckland, I think. There was a discussion around, is it an air barrier or is it a vapor control layer? And
correct.
That internal layer is a vapor control layer.
It is a vapor control layer, and the vapor control layer works ideally optimally if it's also airtight.
But it
also works if it's not airtight, because airtightness is actually addressed much, much more easily from the external side of the building. So your weather-resistive barrier on the outside, your weather membranes, your external sacking, or whatever term is used, is much, much easier to get really, really airtight. And then if you, for example, use if you're worried about leakage or air from the inside of the building towards the outside, if you're taking like a box or something, and I find it really hard, I'm a very visual person, and I've got a box here, you poke a hole in it, so it's leaky from the inside, but it's very, very airtight. You tape all the corners and everything from the outside, and you try to blow into it, nothing goes in because it can't go anywhere because it's sealed up on the outside, right? So if you're worried about leakage of air from the inside of your structure, from the inside of the building towards the outside, but the outside is airtight, it can't even enter your structural space from the inside because it's airtight from the outside, if that makes sense.
Don't you guys, he was super smart. He's pointing out stuff that I hadn't even thought of.
Then it's not quite as important anymore to get the inside really, really airtight as well, but it's really still important from a vapor control point of view. And that's where there's later questions that you're asking about it, of course. We can maybe get to that later in terms of what people are studying.
Because that was going to be my question. Like I was going to say, well, could we just actually talk about this for a little bit? Because people ask me about air tightness, of course, all the time. And they say, well, can I use the external membrane as my air barrier? And I said, well, yeah, the membrane is airtight, but the primary air barrier is ideally on the inside of the frame. Now, what you're saying is that it could be either side.
Could be either side. It's great if it's airtight on the outside, but it's really, really important and much easier to do if you do it on the outside. Did I say inside first? Sorry. It can be on the inside. It's good.
Yeah.
But it's much easier to do on the outside. So maybe I say, look, because it's so much easier from the outside, focus on that first. External part, you have a box of a building, and you don't have blade walls, you don't have funny kind of corners, you don't have bulkheads, you don't have complicated kind of junctions that are usually on the inside.
Okay.
Sealing the inside airtight with wall frames that are kind of going through your airtight layer. You have the hangers that attach to the ceiling. Trying to seal around all those little penetrations, it's really, really difficult and much easier done on the outside, I think.
So if you've got a house that's completely wrapped in an airtight weather-resistive barrier, like roof, walls, down to the slab, everything's wrapped. What happens to vapor drive from the inside? In a cold climate, it's warm and humid. Where does it go?
So cold climate, that's very good. So we should probably put that caveat in as well. We're kind of talking mostly really from climate zone 5 up to 8 in terms of the topics we discuss here.
Yeah,
so,
which is cold.
Basically, south of the Queensland border, everything south of that. Essentially anywhere where you can get frost, areas that can be cold for a while. And yes, there's a vapor drive from the inside to the outside. And that's kind of one of my kind of passion little projects as well, trying to educate people about like how does it actually work? Why do we have a vapor drive from warm to cold or from the inside to the outside? So warm air can hold a lot more moisture than cold air. And we know, for example, that even if it's so simple example, imagine you have 0 degrees outside and it's fog, 100% relative humidity, lots of condensation essentially. Fog means there's like little water droplets in the air, which means you already have had condensation, which means the air can't take any more moisture. That's why you see mist or fog. As it's as wet as it can get on the outside. Then inside, maybe you have 40-50% relative humidity. So kind of in our mindset, it feels like inside is dry, outside is wet because you have mist. Inside there's no mist. Okay, it makes kind of sense. So there should be more moisture on the outside than on the inside. That's not true though, because warm air can hold so much more moisture. You still have roughly twice as much moisture on the inside from a grams per cubic meter point of view compared to the outside. And that's really what counts in terms of where the moisture tries to equalize between inside and outside. And I can go on forever, talk about vapor pressure, stuff like that. But it's essentially a pressure difference between inside and outside from that moisture point of view. And it goes through kind of your building fabric. It goes through materials that are vapor permeable, even if they're airtight. And that's, of course, the external wrap. So we're trying to get anything that comes through from the inside, we try to not stop. So imagine you wear a plastic raincoat, you start sweating. If you have a Gore-Tex jacket, you're meant to not sweat. So that's kind of the idea. But if you're looking at it from a point of your insulation layer, the insulation already kind of gets warm from the inside to cold to the outside. So somewhere in there, if moisture goes through your insulation and then hits that external wrap where it's meant to go through as a vapor, it will already get so cold that you even get some condensation inside your insulation layer. And then we look at plastic raincoats or Gore-Tex jackets when you actually go for a jog. So going jogging in a Gore-Tex jacket, you still start sweating. So that's kind of a similar effect to getting condensation in your wall when you're living in a building because you're producing moisture inside, even with a vapor permeable wrap on the outside. And that's not the key word. The wrap is vapor permeable, but it's also waterproof.
So you're saying equalize pressure from inside to outside. We understand that high humidity wants to go to low humidity, high heat wants to go to low heat.
Correct.
And what I'm asking is when you've got an external air barrier and you've got high vapor pressure or high humidity inside and it's pushing to the outside, you want that to be able to release through the vapor permeable membrane. But if you don't have an internal air barrier, how much of that pressure, because you blew into that box and if it's airtight, nothing's going to go in because it's already full and you can't get any more in.
Yeah, okay.
So
that's another
how
topic.
Does that work?
So there's two types of ways of how moisture can get through your structure from the inside to the outside. So the blowing kind of through the box into the hole is more like an active vapor transport through air leakage. If you have, of course, air leakage in your building, warm air from the inside leaks through your structure, it transports the moisture that already is in the air towards the outside. It kind of hits cold surface and make a condensation. But the second way of vapor transport through your wall is through your structure itself, through vapor permeable materials. So we know that the external wrap is vapor permeable, so it isn't meant to have the moisture pass through, so it doesn't get blocked. The comparison to a plastic raincoat, where it starts then building up because it can't get through, so you have it vapor permeable. Problem though is what I said also with the active vapor transport, because inside your wall, insulation is warm on the inside, but actually cold on the outside. You're already starting inside your wall to hit areas and surfaces where it gets colder. And both modes of transport, the active one with the air moving through or the passive one with diffusion through your structure, that moisture starts hitting those colder surfaces. So you actually get condensation inside your wall. So imagine maybe if you use, again, Gore-Tex jackets, I think they're a great example. Gore-Tex jackets are meant to keep you from sweating when you wear one because it breathes. But then you go for a run and the Gore-Tex jacket will still start sweating. And that's kind of what we're looking at buildings, with a vapor permeable wrap. It's like Gore-Tex. But actually, if you live in a building, it's like you're going jogging. You're producing moisture, you're cooking, you're showering, you're sweating as well. So you're constantly producing moisture. It's more like you're running. An empty building is like you sitting with a Gore-Tex jacket. A lived-in building is like you going up for a little jog and you still sweat. The problem then with Gore-Tex is watertight. It's vapor open, but watertight. So that the wet moisture inside your wall, how does it get through your Gore-Tex? How does it get through? And I think I really loved that when you had that interview with Joe a few months ago from Canada, this kind of idea of improving energy efficiency first and you're actually changing the physics, how your walls work, how moisture gets transported through your wall. Because the way that traditionally water gets through your external wrap is it gets vaporized again. So for vaporizing that moisture inside your wall, you need energy. Where does it come from? It comes from the inside, from the warmer environment. But now you're having lots of insulation in there as well. So the energy doesn't actually come through anymore to vaporize your water. So your water sits in your wall. It can't get out. It can still get vaporized then also from the outside if you have then, north-facing walls or roofs that get hit with sun again during the day when things start warming up. And then they can pass through. The problem is really though with shaded walls or with really super cooled walls, super cooled roofs where you have so much moisture getting in that kind of warming up period is not quite enough to actually dry things out again. And that's where that internal vapor control layer is so important, to stop it from getting into your wall in the first place. And the problem with our kind of general construction plasterboard in the inside, vapor permeable wrap on the outside, the plasterboard is as vapor permeable as your class 4 vapor permeable wrap, almost 1-to-1, like almost exactly the same vapor permeability. So as easily as vapor can get through your wrap on the outside, as easily can it get into the wall in the first place from the inside.
Does it depend on the paint?
It does depend on the paint, but normal paints, like, your living room or something, you're not putting this kind of watertight acrylic kind of glossy stuff on walls. Generally, looks pretty ugly, like it's as vapor open as your vapor permeable wrap.
Okay.
And then the problem is, of course, it can get in very easily, but then it turns into water, into liquid water from vapor because it condenses, because it hits cold surfaces, and then it can't get out anymore. So what you should try is to actually have a higher resistance on the inside. And in Germany, there's kind of a rule of thumb. You're trying to build at least 10 times more vapor inside on the inside compared to the outside. So 10 times more
vapor
tight.
10 times
10
more vapor
times
tight on the inside. And that's in a cold climate, right?
That's again, south from Queensland all the way down to Tassie and further cold climates. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. And in a hot climate, it's 10 times more vapor tight on the outside.
Yeah.
Because,
so it depends,
just want to make sure, because there's people from all over
where you are on the kind of climate range. But yeah. Let's assume just 80% of Australians live kind of in that area.
Yeah. So you're in Canberra. I'm in Adelaide. We live in cold climates.
Right.
That's what we talk about every day.
But interesting. So I didn't even realize, but northern Queensland and a bit further inland, people get frost there. So Armidale and around that area and north from there,
inland,
New South Wales to Queensland. It gets really cold still, and there's periods where it's colder for longer, not exactly close to the coast. So it is relevant for all those areas as well. That's why I say 80-85% of Australians live in those kind of climates.
Yeah. So what you're saying is airtight external barrier, vapor can still get to it, even with your analogy of blowing into the box. It moves through a different means, not through active transfer.
Your wall structure, so through your plasterboard. You think you make an airtight plasterboard, it's fine. But it still goes through that actually as well, and it goes through it quite easily. I think more easily than people realize, because you think class 4 vapor permeable wrap on the outside is to allow things to dry out. Well, things can get into your structure already as easily as they can get out. And then it's actually harder for them to get out, even with that class 4 wrap, because you don't have vapor anymore, because you have actually liquid water in your wall. So you have to vaporize it first again to be able to pass through. And that's the hard thing. Then ideally you should have no insulation in your wall to make that work. So low energy building, badly insulated, healthy building, great, works.
Beautiful.
So we need to start putting insulation in, and the more insulation you add, the higher the risk gets for more condensation in your wall. And then you have to do something on the inside. And that's I think sometimes where I think that's where kind of our kind of policymakers and the whole kind of really the vibe of the community has failed to some degree, where we kind of driving for this high energy efficiency without understanding. Old houses had already mold problems. The really leaky buildings with no insulation. Some mold problems, but generally kind of okay, because they're so leaky, things dry out again. So mold doesn't grow continuously. There's short periods where you have a bit of wetness and then it dries out again. That's fine. The more insulation then you add, and because we haven't actually fixed that small mold problem to start with in our old, sorry, I call them crappy buildings because I feel they are. I don't want to be rude to anyone, but we haven't even fixed kind of the healthy building issue there. And now we're kind of making it worse by not understanding the physics and adding more insulation.
Yep, totally. And that's where some of the policies in government where they've insulated buildings in Melbourne has gone very badly wrong.
Yeah.
They insulate them without understanding the knock-on effects. I mean, I just know of that one particular one. But yeah. So passive house principles, let's not,
Sorry, there's one other example that I'd really like to mention. And that's again about the whole balance thing. Because people focus on energy efficiency, and that's essentially a bit of a kind of you have a spreadsheet with kind of certain heat losses, heat gains, all that kind of thing. And you try to kind of adjust kind of certain performances, certain area to get a certain outcome. And essentially, it's one number that you end up with that you have to beat to be energy efficient, which is your energy consumption, or the heat required, or the amount of energy required to keep your building at a certain kind of comfort level. You can achieve that in many different means. So you can have a super insulated kind of, half a meter thick wall, lots of insulation, but you have single glazed windows. You can then still, hit your overall target by having a certain energy loss by just, improving certain areas. And one of the things that gets really kind of ignored and forgotten is the thermal bridging kind of problem, or thermal break. And I think that's one of the hardest one that's the industry struggling with. That's the least understood. There's a lot of kind of technical structural engineering that's involved in there that kind of that scares people off, I think. And there's a really famous example that I love that's from the US when they had similar problem. Famous architects design a building. It's called the Aqua Tower in Chicago. If you look that one up, Aqua Tower, amazing design. So the reason why it's called Aqua Tower, because it has got all those wraparound balconies that wave in a certain way within the glass facade, and it looks like a bit like water waves. And the plan was there, LEED, they've got this LEED certification system in the States over there with platinum, gold certified, platinum certified, and it was meant to be the highest performing building and from an energy efficiency point of view. So they had all those measures in there, structural thermal breaks were in there from the start, and then it went to the builder. And then what happens, it's a great thing that's called value engineering, where they look at all those components and there's a certain budget and we're stretching it a bit. So let's see where we can save money. We have still this goal. We need to get it to energy efficiency target. We have to be below that number that the building can consume in terms of energy. How do we get there? And then you can imagine almost like a music kind of mixing kind of board with sliders. You increase that and reduce the other one to get to a certain outcome. And so they looked at everything, looked at all the costs, and thought, those structural thermal breaks, never happened before. There's a kind of a new thing coming over from Europe. A bit tricky, maybe not quite sure about the structure there and things like that. How about we kind of leave them away, and compensate by putting more insulation in and maybe slightly better windows. So that's what they did. Went along, left the structural thermal breaks out, had put more insulation in. The sums in the end looked great. So the number at the end, energy efficiency, fantastic, LEED platinum certified, great. But then, so the building is in Chicago, and people might know Chicago is also known as the windy city. Gets really, really cold. So really they get their minus 15s, 20s or something, because it's close to the Canadian border up there, cold winds coming right through from the polar area, and really cold, strong winds. And you can imagine a building with lots of wraparound balconies, a bit like a motorcycle cylinder with all those little fins, great heat exchanger. So all that wind coming past there, balconies that stick through the structure, no thermal breaks. So concrete's already a good conductor. Then you've got all that steel in your concrete that conducts even better. And they had those freezing cold balconies that kind of conducted right through into the building.
Yeah.
And then, of course, very energy efficient. But people lived in there and they started producing moisture and massive condensation issues. So the whole thing turned to glass action in the end. Some people, Aqua Tower, call it the largest indoor waterfall in the world because it's literally concrete slabs that are dripping moisture inside, raining, stalactites, growing, I don't know, because it's so wet. And they didn't take into account those little things. And that's what I say, this is kind of one of the effects that it has when you just focus on energy efficiency and don't understand how a building actually works as a whole in terms of the building physics. And that's what I'm really passionate about. So that's
100%.
what I'm not talking about. And that's, I think, a fantastic example. And the architect afterwards has vowed to never take shortcuts again, always look at the big picture thing. But the building's not there. It's cost a few $1 billion to build it. You can't just knock it down. And there's this kind of, I don't know, in Germany probably would be condemned for being too unhealthy to live in because of all the condensation issues. I'm not sure actually what they did. No, I think they went afterwards to try to wrap all the balconies insulation externally, which is of course a huge effort as a retrofit and way more complicated than installing those structural thermal breaks to start with.
So you're saying that every single balcony was a gigantic thermal bridge just sucking cold into the buildings, and that's what caused the issue.
You look around Australia, how multi-resi construction looks like these days with that really fast precast construction, concrete walls going straight through, balconies going straight through.
Totally.
Same thing. Every time I see that, I kind of, my heart hurts a bit. She's like, oh.
Listener, heed Michael's warning.
Sorry. So don't take it's really, sorry, long story short, what I think is really important to look at a building as a whole, and you have to balance all the different approaches. There's some things people would never think foundations, they're kind of those structural big things and cost lots of money, digging all those piers down to the ground. Let's just skimp on a few and leave a few out, you kind of, and what we're trying to get the people to understand is to know that that's the basics. The things that we actually talk about are the basics of building. Every building should have that. It's not passive house principles. It's basic building principles, and they have to kind of be looked at a balanced way. Another great example that I love is the image of putting glass on a naked person, where people go for one really high performance product and maybe something that looks really good, like windows, that's a good example, but forget about the rest. And that's actually one of kind of my formative experiences that I had in Australia as well, where when I think that was before I started working for Laros actually, and we had bought our house and we were looking at improving things. And, there's a thing called the Sustainable House Day in Canberra. So you go around all those other people's houses that have done great things and they're very proud about their improvements. And I went into this place and they were showing all the things off and their new double glazing that they put in, very proud, and spent lots of money on it. And it was a fairly windy day. And I thought, like, something's going on. The curtains are kind of, waving from left to right on the inside. And I thought, well, maybe they had a window open. And I looked closer and it's like, I kind of can see light through there between the window and the wall. What's going on? And there's a gap between the window and the wall. Like you could see straight through. And that kind of understanding of like using one really good product, but not even understanding how to integrate it properly into your structure, how to make it work with the rest that's around it. And that balanced approach, that's important. And that's got nothing to do with passive house. That's really,
100%.
Air tightness to whatever level is important, but then you also need to look at insulation. Insulation, ideally as seamless as possible. So reducing thermal bridges for any type of building in a balanced approach. No point of putting triple glazing in, having no insulation in your wall. No point of having a half a meter thick wall full of insulation and single glazed windows. No point of having no air tightness and all those other two things, Same with thermal bridges. If you don't address them, then you're kind of focusing all the problems that you would have with otherwise in your structure to that one point that you haven't addressed it. That's kind of that example with the Aqua Tower, I think, where they have a really energy efficient building, still very energy efficient, but fails completely on so many other
failure.
levels. So it's
not habitable almost. I will look up, or not almost, not really habitable.
Yeah, look it up. It's a very nice building too. It looks really cool. Yeah,
I will look it up.
Fantastic.
And I love a good building failure case study, and I'll link it in the show notes for anyone who wants to read a little bit more about that. It's time for a quick sponsor shout out. Today's episode of the Building Sciology Potty is proudly brought to you by our amazing sponsors, Enduro Builders and Climasure. A huge thank you to these incredible businesses for supporting the podcast and helping us spread the word about better buildings to live and breathe in. Your support makes this podcast possible. Please head over to their websites and follow their social pages. So, Michael, a lot of builders are getting increasingly nervous about condensation and moisture issues. So what is the most common failure that you see that leads to this, most common issue that you see that leads to this failure, and how can it be avoided with smarter detailing or better sequencing?
Yeah, I guess first we have to kind of think about what does actually moisture failure mean, or what's the failure? Does it mean your building is falling apart or collapsing or something? In my mind, moisture failure is when you have mold in your building. Who wants to live in a mold building? It's a really unhealthy living environment. We know that mold kind of can cause a lot of problems, asthma, other things. Makes you kind of physically, I think, kind of weak, concentration issues, all that kind of stuff. There's lots of effect in our body, I think. So having mold in your building, I think that's in my mind, that's when you failed. Especially, and that's where the sequencing thing comes in as well. I find quite a few buildings that I go into and they're already moldy right from the very, very start. And I think the biggest problem there and the failure there is that the traditional kind of way of how Australian buildings are built is you put the frames up and then they sit in the weather for a while. Then eventually you get some windows and they come in and they get installed and the frames are still sitting there in the weather. And then after some months, maybe some kind of wraps go on, maybe, or anti-con first or something. And then things get wrapped up. So having those timber frames sitting in the weather, exposed for months and months, especially bottom plates, so that's kind of that bottom element of timber that sits on the slab, for example, they get completely saturated. They're wet, they're sitting in water. And then, because the builders are also on a schedule, they have to finish things off, and then there's not necessarily time to let things dry out. Things get wrapped, things get insulated, the internal wall gets put on, and you're ending up with a structure that's already wet and moldy right from the very start in a brand new building. So that's in my mind, the kind of way where people have to rethink the sequencing. In my mind, you put the frames up, you put the wrap up right away. You protect your frames, keep them dry. You have a nice, much more comfortable working environment. You can do then other work inside with being out of the weather, out of the wind, and you're protecting the structure right from the start. Mm-hmm. So as fast as you can, put your frames up and protect them.
Protect them straight away. I actually had a friend go to New Zealand over the July school holidays, and she sent me some photos of, I'd heard of people using tents to build their structures in like Europe and in New Zealand, but I'd never actually seen it or, knew anybody who had actually seen it. And she did. So over in New Zealand right now, there's construction projects going on where maybe they're not using a building wrap. Maybe it's an alternative wall system, and they're building it inside a tent because it's winter. and it's cold.
I
And
think
wet.
that's maybe a bit of an extreme. I think that's obviously works. Gets you out of the weather. I think it's also okay to actually build your structure as a tent essentially right away. Even if it does get, 1 or 2 days of rain is no problem. If you wrap it right away, then things can dry out again over the many, many, many months until the building is actually finished. The problem is where it's already sitting many months in the weather without being protected. So even if you don't have a tent right from the start, if you put the wrap on, then you have a tent that you can work in, but it's your building. You don't have to double up on the tent, I guess. I think people probably still use the membranes in New Zealand as well after they've done their tent, but
yes,
they don't even want to get
it's
anything wet
it's
to start with.
it's not realistic to put up a tent in most construction sites in Australia. So the sequencing of the wrap and the frames in the wrap is extremely important. I put up a post recently about a structure here in Adelaide that was left out in the winter, I reckon at least 2 winters, maybe more. The first builder was, I think they went insolvent, and another builder took over, and that building is completely destroyed. Like the frames are black.
Yeah, warped, twisted, bowed.
They are black. And I drove past a few months after I first noticed this building, and it was being finished, bricked up, clad, ready for people to move in. They were bought off the plan years before, 2021. They were bought off the plan by unsuspecting homeowners. The renders look lovely, and the actual as-built product has not been protected from the weather. And it's just a health hazard like you wouldn't believe. And the comments on the post were, that's happening around the corner from me, or I know another project this is happening to, or yeah, my neighbours, or yeah, this, yeah, that. There's so many examples of timber structures that have been left out in the weather, not protected, and have gone mouldy before they're even finished.
Yeah, I think that's just the common way of how buildings are built. I think pretty much almost every building that doesn't have the wrap put on right away is one of those. And I think that's probably 98% of all new buildings, really. And another thing that I find, again, is really important in terms of moisture failure. Of course, we had COVID. We had lots of issues with timber supply, and people went a lot over to steel frames. So one of the other things, that mistake that I think people make, even if you do everything perfectly right, from a vapor permeable wrap on the outside, insulation, good insulation in your steel frames, and then even the internal vapor control layer, it still doesn't work. So steel is such a good conductor. You're putting the plasterboard on the inside onto your steel, and you actually can, after sometimes even less than a year, you can start seeing the outline of your steel on the inside of the plasterboard because there's mold growth. The steel gets so cold in winter that it conducts right through. Having a vapor permeable wrap on, the vapor control layer on the inside on a cold surface does not work. So the condensation happens right on that surface then. And so it doesn't. So what you want to do with the vapor control layer is you want to stop moisture from getting to any cold area inside your structure. But because the cold area is right on the inside, it's right there, right? So it doesn't stop moisture from getting to that cold spot. And then the
vapor control layers are also water sensitive too. So
exactly.
If there's condensation, they'll just break down.
Getting them wet, they start breaking down. That's right. And then the next thing is like, people understand, okay, steel frames, I have to put a thermal break in. But they don't put the thermal break in, they put a thermal break on. So you see things then where they have this thermal kind of break strip that gets attached to the outside of the steel frame or to the very inside of the steel frame, and they're totally useless. A thermal break only works if it's inside the insulation layer. So you have to surround the thermal break with insulation to make it actually work. Putting a strip on the outside means that the edges of where it kind of overlaps with your external, the outside of your structure is at outside temperature. Imagine 0 degrees outside means the outside of the structure is at 0 degrees, which means the inside and the outside of your thermal break are both at 0 degrees. Totally useless. It's not thermally breaking, it's not thermally disconnecting anything. And the same if you do it on the inside. The wall on the inside is 20 degrees, your room is 20 degrees. The inside and the outside of your thermal break, if you just stick it on the inside, they're both the same. So it doesn't work.
So you're saying that steel has to be completely encapsulated?
The more the better. So you have to bring at least your insulation into the thickness of the thermal break, or ideally further, which doesn't work with a 10 mil kind of strip. That product doesn't really exist that then kind of makes that product. From an insulation point of view, you have your insulation pads 90 mil thick. There's other risks if you start then sticking, like, for example, a 10 mil or 20 mil XPS on the outside to kind of cover up that thermal break. That's where we come into the 2/3, 1/3 rule kind of thing. That's another
That's
topic.
a whole nother issue.
Maybe let's stick there for now. So thermal breaks don't work if you just stick them onto your structure. They have to be inside your insulation layer. And that's another big mistake that we see that people do all the time.
So hang on, sorry.
Think where you spend more money.
the thermal break has to be inside the insulation layer, or the thermal bridge has to be inside?
Thermal break. So steel is a thermal bridge that's already
Yes.
into insulation layer, but the thermal break
Yeah.
then ideally has to be as much in the middle of the insulation layer as possible. It doesn't work if
A
you just
thermal
stick it
break.
on. Thermal
But you
break.
can't put a thermal break in the middle of a piece of
Correct.
steel.
No, that's the big problem now with steel frames, right?
You
So
can't split
maybe
it.
think about that when you do steel frames. So you can. There are ways. You have to either double up, so 2 steel frames with a gap, and insulate in between as well, so they don't go right all the way through. That's of course then kind of people put steel in because it's cheaper than timber. So that's kind of counteracting that, doing something cheaper. I use steel and I don't have the termite problem and all kind of stuff. Not realizing that they're kind of building themselves a mold bunker.
A petri
Especially
dish.
commercial
Because you've still
construction,
got
everything is
plasterboard.
done in steel. So
You've
many
still got,
schools that are built in Canberra at the moment that are all steel. Steel that runs straight through from the inside to the outside, structural elements, like big steel beams that have, support
Yeah.
cantilevered roof overhangs, stuff like that. They'll be sweating on the
I've
inside.
had a number of calls from modular builders who are so confused as to why their roof spaces are all moldy and wet.
Yeah. Because there's structural elements, very highly conductive elements that
Very
run
highly
straight through from
conductive.
the inside to the outside. So thermal break
Yeah.
has to be always as much as possible in the middle of your insulation layer. Otherwise, it's useless. Not useless, but less effective. It's definitely useless if you only stick it on to the surface. A thermal break on the surface is not a thermal
Which is
break.
all we do.
Yeah, which is kind of
Okay.
what's done
All
at the
right.
moment in the industry. So
All
that's
right. Okay.
another big thing. Yeah.
Interesting. Thank
One
you.
of
I learned something.
my passion, kind of trying to explain that to people.
I'm learning a lot here. Budget.
Budget.
All of this stuff is great.
Everyone's got
Thermal
one.
breaks, good windows, hoo-has, wide blahs. Let's talk about balancing all of that with budget.
So yeah, there's a cost, of course, to everything, right? People have usually a budget, and people want to have nice things. Generally, the things that people focus on are the things that they can see. So that's high-end kind of fittings, finishes, really nice kitchens, good appliances. One of the problems with the things that we do is that they're all invisible. They're inside your building structure, and that's why they're kind of often easily ignored, especially then if people don't understand why they're actually important. Funny thing is, nobody kind of questions foundations of a building. I guess they kind of make more sense. If you don't have good foundations, your building might fall over. That's actually true. But I think all the things that we talk about are just as important as good foundations, because who wants to live in a moldy building? Maybe shift, if budget is an issue, think about if maybe some of those kind of concepts that people have as their dream house can be shifted from things that can be changed later in your building to things that cannot be changed easily later in your building. So focus more on that stuff that are hidden inside your structure. Get that right first. Then you can, down the track, maybe save a bit more money and get those really high-end, the best kind of $500 taps in your bathroom, better kind of ovens and appliances, marble bench tops in your kitchen. Another thing is size. Maybe think about, like, do you really need a 350 square meter house with people? If you have budget constraints, the easiest thing is to make it a bit smaller. Maybe, that third rumpus room. Square meters cost, building size costs. If you can't afford it, or if you can only afford that giant big building by building it where you have mold in your structure, maybe think about that.
Yeah. We went to, I was at the Passive House conference a couple of months ago, and there was a presentation there who was talking about public housing in, oh goodness, where was it? Somewhere on the eastern seaboard.
Maybe in Canberra, because I have that here, public housing, steel frames, all that kind of stuff. Very sad story.
No, this was Passive House public housing.
Public housing, great.
Literally, yeah. Yes,
Okay.
and they were small. They were government-funded public housing units, but they were certified Passive House. Completely, within a reasonable budget that could be, most people would be able to come at, but they were smaller. And I just, from the outside, they look like your average brick veneer public housing project, but on the inside, they were healthy air, mold-free, comfortable, peace of mind for the people who were inside those buildings, who were the more vulnerable people in the community. And I just thought, fabulous.
I think maybe that's another big misconception. People think passive houses are really expensive, and they are, mostly because passive houses added on as an afterthought. So you have your existing design, and then you try to make it passive house versus trying design with that kind of mindset right from the very start. And the other thing is people think passive houses are always small, kind of boring boxes. So both are not true. So you can make a passive house cost effectively by thinking it right from the start. And it doesn't have to be a boring box. Yes, if it's not a boring box, it's generally more difficult to make a passive house, and it doesn't always easily get there. And then you might have to spend a lot more money. But especially if you think of it right from the start, think where your air tightness layer has to be, think where thermal bridging might be, and design it right in from the start and an afterthought. You can save a lot of money, and you can actually offset some reasonably high costs by having a much more efficient building that has lower energy needs. You can replace your slab, in-slab hydronic heating. That's 30, 50 grand of whatever with massive energy. By offsetting it, maybe spend more money on the windows, for example, to get higher performance there. And you don't need that system in the first place. You can have to replace some systems that cost a lot of money as well by going for passive. So you offset some costs. So there's cost offsetting, there's good planning right from the start, and you can build almost as cost effectively, especially if you don't tack it on afterwards as an afterthought.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. You got to think about these things from the very start, and then it's a whole lot easier.
And then it might influence your design. It will influence your design. That's true. But and then it probably gets to something that is in your budget and still can look nice as well. So they're not mutually exclusive. You can almost make anything into a passive house, but there's then it costs more. If you have this crazy design with lots of walls, optimize your surface area to some degree, as I say, because that then comes down to people's budget. And if they allow for that right away, then it's not out of people's reach, I think.
It's definitely not. And I think if the homeowner comes to this design process with an open mind and is willing to compromise on the things that they had their heart set on in order to achieve a certified passive house outcome, then there can be a lot more, the process is a lot easier. I think the problem comes, and I know just around my office, a lot of there's a real contention between what people want and what they can afford. And when it comes to passive house, I think that the grand ideas of their beautiful dream home have to be potentially, not always, but potentially pared back a little bit in order to allow for all of those performance elements that are going to make the house much more durable and much more healthy. So I think the open-mindedness has to be there from the outset.
And I think if people also think about, they would never question the foundations of the building, whatever their grand design is, and they know that's a cost and that's part of the budget. And as I said before, those kind of things are as important as a foundation of your building, because otherwise you have all those other problems. And also maybe not every building actually has to be passive house performance. It can be a high performance building that's not quite there. Not everyone's driving a Ferrari. A Camry is a really good car that gets you from A to B as well. That has tires on, that has a windscreen on, or I love those little comparisons. Everyone knows cars, and people think like, my builder told me I shouldn't have tires on because we've never done it before. We've been driving on our rims essentially. You can drive a car like that. It's a bit uncomfortable. It's not very healthy. You have to brake very carefully because it doesn't stop suddenly. But it's possible. Windscreen, same thing. You put your airplane goggles on. You don't have a windscreen. You get all the flies. You get a bit wet when it rains. But it kind of works. But then you have this really shiny car. Essentially, everyone's driving their cabriolet. No roof, no windscreen, and no tires on the rims. That's kind of the focus on. But the foundations that say there's even rims there in the first place. You're not driving on your brake kind of discs or something. That's like the foundation of the building. Nobody questions them. You have to have them. You can't not have them. But the other things like windscreens. This piece of glass that's kind of curved in 2 dimensions is probably very expensive. And we always had our goggles. It worked as well. Don't worry about that. It's kind of that idea. So it's.
That's hilarious. Right, mechanical ventilation. Let's talk about the difference between HRV and ERV and what ERV actually does, because I think the understanding of HRV, or at least in the people I talk to, is fairly well understood, the concept of it, but ERV less so. So could you please explain for the listener
so
and for me?
Basically, what does it mean? HRV, heat recovery ventilation, versus ERV, energy recovery ventilation. ERV does also moisture recovery, essentially. So you have any recovery ventilation system, heat or energy, has 2 air streams, one ingoing, one outgoing. They go through a heat exchanger, and the heat exchanger works on like the outgoing air. Like take the winter case, the outgoing air heats up the incoming air, and they're very efficient. And then there's 2 types of heat exchangers. One is just a metal one that's a very good conductor and has a very good heat exchange. That's your HRV. And one actually has a kind of almost like a functional membrane that also has good heat recovery, but also lets moisture pass through between the airstreams. And one of the things that people are not aware of, if they're actually building a high-performance building with a ventilation system, any ventilation system, and in winter you bring cold air in from the outside, you're totally drying out your building. 24/7 you're bringing cold air in, that gets warmed up, then it's, as I said before, it's much drier than the inside air, and you're actually drying out your house. You will suddenly start to have to humidify your building to not get your kind of ice shriveling away because you really dry out. And the funny thing is, in a bad building, it's important to do that because you want to avoid condensation on all those cold surfaces. But you still even get condensation on, like, thermally non-broken windows, even with a ERV running full blast and like 20% relative humidity inside, where it's really unhealthy. So your eyes shrivel, but you still have wetness. And that kind of understanding of having a dry building that's healthy, but also having a healthy living environment, but not having your eyes shrivel because it's like Sahara conditions, that's kind of the difference. And so the ERV helps you to actually retain some of the moisture that's inside, so you don't totally dry out your house. Or going to the tropics or climates where it's really humid outside, it actually rejects some of that moist air that comes in and back outside again, so you don't need to run a dehumidifier as much as otherwise. So that's a big advantage. They look on paper usually from a you could call it temperature recovery point of view, not as efficient. Because so what happens in an HRV, you get condensation. The incoming airstream is really, really cold. You have the outcoming airstream passing on its heat to the incoming airstream, cooling down, and then you have condensation. Air with moisture cooling down. That condensation needs to be drained away somewhere. So you have your ventilation system somewhere in the middle of the house. You need to allow for condensate drain. In an ERV, you can usually ignore those condensate drains because there's enough moisture being passed on into that warming up airstream that you don't get as much condensation, almost nothing, inside your unit, and you actually don't dry out your place. So that's kind of the big difference.
So ERV is applicable in cold climates still?
Cold climates,
like drier
really hot climates, but you'd be surprised. I would say an ERV is almost always a better choice than an HRV in terms of drying things out. Or
interesting.
Like again, if you go to humid climates, then so partially kind of dry climates in winter, but also sometimes really humid climates in summer, you want to keep that moisture outside. And then having a ventilation system running in summer, it's really hot outside, cool in outgoing air, cools down the incoming air, but you still have all the moisture coming in, and then you run into even more moisture problems because cold air can hold less moisture. You bring in warm, moist air in. You want to reject as much of that moisture right from the very start as possible. So really humid climates, really cold climates, ERV. If you kind of look at Australia, in the end, it's kind of almost everywhere until you get to a place where it kind of, almost in between, which it doesn't happen either. It's cold or humid sometimes at the same time in many areas. So I think generally they're the better choice. They are, especially for counterflow systems. So there's another kind of differentiation. There's counterflow heat exchangers, there's rotary wheel heat exchangers, there's all sorts of other different technologies. If you have counterflow heat exchangers, they're probably the most efficient units, and they're also a lot more expensive as an ERV. So there's HRV cores, again, core, heat exchange core with like aluminium heat exchangers or something. They're a lot cheaper than those kind of vapor permeable kind of, almost kind of membrane heat exchangers. But I think still worthwhile. I think they're a better choice in the long term. Yes, there's a higher upfront cost for many ERVs.
So why are HRVs more widely used than ERVs?
Because they look better on paper. They look like they're more efficient because they don't take into account that you then have to run a humidifier or dehumidifier in the background somewhere that also uses energy. So HRVs are generally having a higher temperature kind of heat recovery, essentially. So, air coming in, air going out, 20 degrees inside, 0 degrees outside. In an HRV, the air comes in at 18.5 degrees, and in ERV, it only comes in at 17.5 degrees or something. So they look better on paper from a heat recovery point of view.
So you're saying that with an HRV, you might have to run a dehumidifier?
Dehumidifier in humid climates, 100%. You have to often anyway.
In humid climates, yeah. But I know that it's a recommendation.
You have to run a humidifier in cold climates.
Well, in my building biology study, we are told never, ever, ever use a humidifier, ever. There's no reason ever to use it.
Well,
because that creates it creates a high humidity mold problem.
Yeah, okay, then the people there don't understand how dry actually things get when your eyes start shriveling, and how unhealthy you get when your nose starts drying out, your mucus kind of layers start drying out, and you actually get more susceptible to diseases, to colds and COVID, any of those kind of things. So people get sick much more easily in really, really dry buildings.
And that's
Because
using an HRV
defenses don't work
only.
as well.
Potentially, there's a risk there using
That's
HRV
a
only.
lot. That's massively increased or exacerbated the effect if you use HRV only.
And even if you're producing moisture in the building with breathing, cooking, bathing, washing, even in those circumstances?
So it depends. It might be good enough, but because things get extracted right away, usually from the points where the moisture is produced. So in your bathroom, you have your UV running and it extracts from all the moist areas, and where you need that moisture, for example, in your bedroom or something, it might not get there.
Interesting. Okay.
And I would be interested. So again, we've got passive house certified office here, and I know we've got the timber cracking in the walls, cracks opening up. I know we have a relative humidity of well below 30%. We have 2 humidifiers running 24/7 to try to keep the moisture levels up. We turn the ventilation system off overnight because there's nobody here, of course, so to not bring more cold, dry air in, because we're really drying out that space. But also it's an office, so we're not cooking or showering here, but we have like 6-7 people
breathing,
sweating, breathing, drinking coffees, making teas, things like that. The kettle is running, and it's not enough. It's not anywhere near enough. We have, that's even with one ERV. We've got one ERV and one HRV running in parallel, upstairs, downstairs. Upstairs, we've got the ERV, and it's not enough to even then maintain healthy humidity levels.
That's really interesting. And I think the key message there is to monitor.
Exactly. Monitor, see what's going on, and then react. So I grew up in Germany, and I know from even just having radiative heaters, everyone had their little kind of water kind of pockets hanging on the heaters that were evaporating. You had to refill every 2 or 3 days to keep humidity levels up to a certain degree. That's no ventilation at all. That's just open doors and windows every now and then to let fresh air in, and then bring in dry, cold air in, heating it up, and you're drying out the inside, essentially. And things got to dry, and that's in houses that are cooked in, lived in, showered in, still getting to dry. All the buildings that I lived in as a kid had humidifiers essentially as part of the package. You're heating a house, you have to humidify it because things just get to dry. Just even from opening doors and windows a few times.
All right, folks, that is the end of part 1 of my conversation with Michael Kingsland. I am going to drop the second part of this conversation next week, so you don't have to wait 2 weeks this time. Next Monday, part 2 will be in your ears, so keep an eye out for that one. In the meantime, drop a follow or a review if you're liking the content so far, and I'll catch you next time. Until then, happy, healthy building.